Hello, Windows Insiders. I'm Paul Gilday. I'm a program manager on the Windows UI team. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about Windows composition and how to use it inside of a XAML application. Today we're going to be talking about kind of visuals and brushes, kind of the basic building blocks of our API. We'll talk a little bit about animations, and then we're going to talk about effects. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to kind of do a high-level 101 kind of basics coding demo. And we're just going to kind of give you a breadth of the API capabilities and kind of just a simple demo. So let's dive right into the code. So here's Visual Studio. But first, let me show you our desired outcome. So we're just going to be building a basic sample here where we're going to create an image, we're going to spin it, and we're going to add some effects, which is really cool. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to be able to create composition objects. And the way that we do that is we use a shared instance to a compositor object that XAML creates on our behalf in the framework. And the reason that we want to get an instance to that specific compositor, because we could new up our own, is we want to be able to interop with the same visuals that XAML provides. And so having that shared instance allows us to create our own visuals, but then we can interop them with XAML's visuals as well. And so I'm going to write a line of code here, and we're basically going to try and unpack this to kind of understand what's going on here. So the first concept is whenever you create a visual, if you call .compositor on that visual, you'll get a back pointer kind of to the compositor that created it. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to get access to a visual that XAML creates for us so that we can get that shared instance. And one of the ways that we do that is we use this class in the Windows.ui.xaml.hosting namespace called Element Composition Preview. And so there's some methods on this class that allows us to kind of get visuals that XAML has created and set our own visuals within visuals that XAML creates for us. And so one of the ways that we do that is we call get element visual on this. And so this is a UI element. And so essentially every UI element has some form of a handoff visual associated with it that XAML creates for us. And so by calling get element visual on this, which is main page, this is just basically our page, which is also a UI element, we can get access to that visual, that handoff visual, and then get access to the compositor that is the shared instance that XAML created for us. So it's a big line of code, but it's how we get access to the shared compositor that XAML creates for us. So once we have our compositor, the next thing we want to do is we want to start to build out some of our composition object primitives. One of those primitives is a visual. And so visual is our base class, and so we have some derivations of that. We have sprite visuals, which are little boxes that hold content. We have container visuals that allow you to group visual togethers into trees. And so we're just going to talk about that, but we can go into more detail later in another video. And so the next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a sprite visual. And I'm going to give that visual a size, I'm going to give it an offset, and I'm going to give it a center point to basically move that center point from the top left corner to the middle of that visual. And you'll kind of see why when we do some more examples when we start manipulating the visual later on in this demo. So I've created my visual. The next thing that I need to do is I need to kind of parent that guy in underneath that handoff visual that XAML creates for us, so I can get that visual into the scene of our application. And the way that we do that is we use that element composition preview class as well, and we call set element child visual. We pass in a UI element, which is just the main page here, and we pass in that visual that we've created on the app side to say, hey, can you put that on our handoff visual? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to run this application now. So we've created that visual, we've given it a size, we've given it an offset, and then we've added it to the scene, but we don't see any content. That's because by default, our visuals don't have content inside of them. And so one of the ways that we can get content inside of a visual is we use brushes. And so let's type in this next line of code here, and let's create a thing called a color brush. We have other types of brushes too, so you can kind of look through our API, you can see the types of brushes, but color is the most basic one. And so I'm just going to create a color brush here with the color red, and then I'm going to take that brush and I'm going to apply it to our visual using the brush property. So now when I F5 this application, we should see a red visual in our application, kind of in the middle there, offset, from the left-hand corner. So there you go. I've created a visual, and now we've put it inside our XAML application. So that's well and good. And one of the things that we want to really talk about now is how do we manipulate visuals in a more interesting way? One of the ways that we can do that is we can apply animations. And so our animation system is interesting in that we have two types of animations. We have kind of your basic keyframe animations. If you're familiar with XAML storyboards, you'll be very familiar with keyframe animations where you define a starting point and an ending point, a duration, possibly an interpolation function to go across those values, but you're essentially setting keyframes and values. We also have expression animations, which I'll get into a little bit later, but let's move forward with kind of the basic kind of keyframe animations. So our next step here is I'm going to create a scalar keyframe animation. And so we have different types of keyframe animations for the types of properties that we have that we can manipulate. So for this instance, we're just creating a scalar keyframe animation, and we're inserting a ending keyframe with a value. And so that value is 360. And so the thing that we want to actually do is we want to take that red visual that we have on the screen, and we just want to rotate it 360 degrees. And so we're going to be targeting a scalar property of a visual that will allow us to rotate the visual. We give that guy a duration, so we're going to do it for 3-ish seconds, and then we're going to give it an iteration behavior just so that this thing will just kind of keep kicking off so that it only does it once. The next thing that we need to do is we need to actually take that animation, because this is just a description. This is just a description of an animation. It doesn't actually do anything. And so what we need to do is we need to apply it to a property and then call start animation to get that to actually kick off and execute. So the next line of code here is we get our visual and we say start animation, and the property that we want to target is the rotation angle in degrees property. Now this type is a scalar type, and so that's why we created our scalar keyframe animation. So we hand in that animation, and so now with the execution of this function here, we should start to see our keyframe animation going from the current value that the visual is at to 360 degrees within 3 seconds, and it's going to keep iterating indefinitely, essentially. So now you've kind of seen how we can add animation to our application. Cool. So the next thing we're going to talk about, there we go. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is how do we get more, I would say, interesting content into our visuals. As I said before, brushes are the way that we get content into visuals. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to figure out how do I get, say, pixel data into a brush so that I can brush it onto a visual. And so one of the core underlying components that we have is we have this thing called a composition drawing surface. And so this is a surface that allows us to draw like pixel data on it. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to say, hey, how do I load, say, an image from a URI, get that pixel data, draw it onto a surface, and then how do I get that surface content into a brush? Well, so we have a little helper library that does kind of all of those steps for you, and we'll go into it in another video, kind of in more detail. But so if you just kind of understand that process of how do I load image data, take that pixel data, draw it onto a surface, this little helper library takes care of that for you. So once we have our composition drawing surface, we need a brush. And luckily, our compositor, we have a composition surface brush. So the next line of code here is we're going to create a surface brush. And we're going to pass in that surface, which has our loaded pixel data that we talked about on that whole process of going from a file on disk all the way up to drawing pixel data onto a surface. And then we apply that surface brush to our visual. So now when we hit F5, we should see our visual having more dynamic content, or in this case, a picture of a nice little flower. Awesome. And it's still animating, and it looks pretty good. So this kind of leads us up to the next set of API areas that are very interesting in the composition world. And we're going to start talking about effects. And oddly enough, effects need some sort of input, like pixel data, that they can run effects over top of to produce some output, which is typically pixel data. But remember, we want to actually start and create brushes. So let's talk a little bit about that process, and let's talk about that with some framing of code. So let's see here. So our next line here, we're going to say we need to be able to create an effect description. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create an effect description. The effect descriptions that we leverage in composition today are the exact same effect descriptions supplied by Win2D. So if you're familiar with that library, you'll notice that we'll actually in this application here, we're actually referencing the Win2D library. And so the way that you do that is if you right-click here, you say Manage NuGet Packages, search for Win2D, and then you can install that into your project. We've already done that, and so and then we've referenced the right namespaces, and so here we can actually start defining effect descriptions. And if you look at their documentations, you'll be able to understand which effect descriptions are supported with Windows Composition and which ones are supported by default in Win2D. And so right here, this description that we have, this is a saturation effect description. And what this does is it's essentially it's a shader that lets us apply saturation to some image data. And so right here, we create it, we give it a name, and so the thing that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to refer to this effect, because we're essentially building a small little effect graph. It's a simple one, but we're building one up, and the concepts are the same when you start to chain these things together. So we give it a name so we can refer to it later. We set the saturation property to 0, because what we want to do is we want to kind of take away all of the saturation in that image that we have. And then we pass in this composition effect source parameter. And so essentially what this does is this gives us a bindable spot in our effect graph that we can set that input data into and allow the effect to run over that data. And that allows us to set it dynamically at runtime. And you'll see later on when we actually set the effect. So all this does is this is just a description of the type of effect that we want to have. The next thing that we need to do is we need to actually kind of compile that. And the way that we do that is we need to create a factory that will compile that and then generate our effect brushes. So the next line, I type in here, is we create our composition effect factory. And so the way that we do that is we take that description and off of our compositor, you see create effect factory. And then we're also doing something interesting here. So we're specifying a property that we want to be animatable. And so what's going to happen here is when we initialize the effect factory, it's going to say, the saturation property of this effect description up here, composition will be able to animate that property so that we can set it and animate it with different types of animations, which we'll go into a little bit later. So once we've kind of created our factory, now we need to be able to take that factory and then start creating effect brushes from it. So the next line of code here, you'll see we're taking our effect factory, we're creating a brush, and then we're setting the source parameter of that brush. And remember when we said before our composition effect source parameter, this is kind of that bindable spot, and we're taking that surface brush data, which is our image data that we talked about before, and we're running it through that saturation effect. And so the output of that effect, which should be the output of our brush, like the content that's actually in the brush. And so the nice thing with visuals is that brush is the object that we use to paint on content. And so we just pass in that saturation effect brush, which has taken our image data, applied an effect over top of it, and the output of that brush, we're going to brush that onto the visual. And so now when we hit F5, we should see our rotating picture, but the content of that picture should be a little bit different. And that content is actually desaturated. And so here's a neat example of how we can apply effects to our visuals using the same components that we have in our toolbox in the Windows Composition namespace. Awesome. So we added an effect. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to do something really cool with the effects. And remember, before we added in that animatable saturation property. And so let's go animate the saturation from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. And so we could do that with a keyframe animation. We could set that for a duration to match the rotation of our visual. But let's do something a little bit more interesting. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create an expression animation. And so an expression animation is a way for you to create an animation that uses an expression to basically generate values. And those values can be mapped to different properties. And also the values can reference other composition objects that have other values and properties. And so there's just a big generic way of saying, hey, I can map a property from a composition object, use that as input to my expression, and generate an output that isn't bound by time. Because animations typically we think of, oh, hey, it's like 0 to some value over some duration of time. But you'll notice here when I actually create this expression animation, I'm not specifying any duration for how long this animation should run. What I am setting is I'm setting this thing called a reference parameter. And that reference parameter is the visual. So it's actually that composition object, our visual that we have. And I'm just giving it a name here so that I can refer to it in our expression. And so what I'm doing here is this is a very simple expression. But basically what I'm doing is I'm taking that rotation, angle, and degrees property. So that's the property that we're subsequently animating with our keyframe animation. So that value is going to change over time. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, let's take that value, divide it by 360, and subtract it from 1. And so what's going to happen is as that visual rotates, the saturation of the effect is going to change at the same time, which is kind of pretty cool if you really think about it. So let me do this last bit of code here to wire it up. And so one of the interesting things here is you'll see that I'm targeting the saturation effect brush, not the visual. That's because I want to animate and manipulate the effect. But brushes are composition objects, and so that means we can animate them with our animation system. So not only can we animate things like visuals with our animation system, we can animate effects, and so basically anything that derives from composition object, we can animate that guy. So let me hit F5, and so hopefully we should see on the screen a rotating image, and then the saturation change as that image rotates. And so there you go. Awesome. So I'm going to close this guy here. So today we talked a little bit about how to do Windows composition in a XAML application. We talked about visuals, talked about brushes, we talked about animations and effects. This was kind of a high-level kind of tutorial of like a smattering of features that we have. We're going to go into more detail in each of these areas, and so I highly recommend that you follow us on Twitter to get announcements and news, and then also check out this code example on our GitHub repository, and there you'll find a whole bunch of samples that our entire team is creating to kind of demonstrate how to use Windows UI, use composition, and use XAML. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.